There is a photograph taken in the Pantanal wetlands of western Brazil that has circulated among wildlife researchers and naturalists for years. Not because it is dramatic in the way that most predator photographs are dramatic, but because of what it requires you to understand before you can fully appreciate what you are seeing. In the photograph, a jaguar is emerging from the water onto a muddy bank, and in its jaws, it is carrying a Jaguar caiman. If what you just heard makes you want to keep going, stay here. This is exactly the kind of content we make, and there is a lot more of it. Subscribe now so you do not miss what comes next. The caiman is not small. It is an adult animal, somewhere between 5 and 7 feet in length, armored along its back and tail with osteoderms that function as a kind of biological chainmail, with a jaw capable of generating bite forces that would destroy a human hand. The jaguar is carrying it the way a Labrador retriever carries a retrieved bird, effortlessly, calmly, with the jaw positioned not at the caiman's neck or body, but precisely at the top and back of its skull. If you know anything about how large cats kill prey, that detail should stop you, because no other big cat on Earth kills that way. Not lions, not tigers, not leopards, not cheetahs, not snow leopards, not cougars. The killing bite of every other large felid in the world is a suffocation bite, delivered to the throat or the muzzle, designed to cut off airflow, to hold the prey animal in a controlled position while it slowly loses oxygen. The killing takes time. It takes minutes. Sometimes, it takes a very long time. The jaguar in that photograph did something categorically different. It drove its canine teeth through the armored skull of a reptile that is designed by evolution to resist exactly that kind of force, and it killed it, not by suffocating it, but by destroying its brain, directly, in an instant, or close enough to an instant that the distinction barely matters to the caiman. This is not a minor variation on a common theme. This is a genuinely distinct predatory strategy, a technique so unusual in the context of large cat behavior that when researchers first began documenting it systematically, there was real scientific debate about whether it was an individual behavioral quirk of particularly large or skilled jaguars, a regional adaptation specific to caiman hunting populations, or something more fundamental about the jaguar's biology and its relationship to the specific ecological pressures that shaped it over millions of years. The answer that has emerged from decades of behavioral ecology research, biomechanical analysis, and population-level observation is that the skull strike technique is not an anomaly. It is not a trick that individual genius jaguars invented. It is the expression of a suite of physical and neurological adaptations that are unique to Panthera onca among all living felids. Adaptations that were built specifically for a hunting environment that no other big cat has ever faced in its evolutionary history, and that have produced in the jaguar an animal that kills in a way that looks, to a mammalian predator, familiar with the logic of suffocation killing, almost like it belongs to a different category of predator entirely. To understand why jaguars kill the way they do, you have to understand where they come from, not geographically, but biologically, in the deep evolutionary sense. Jaguars are the only surviving member of the genus Panthera to have evolved primarily in the Americas, and that distinction matters more than it might initially seem. The other big cats, lions, tigers, leopards, snow leopards, clouded leopards, evolved in Africa and Asia against a backdrop of prey communities that were, by the time those species were developing their hunting strategies, already substantially defined by large terrestrial mammals. Wildebeest and zebra for lions, deer and wild boar and gaur for tigers, impala and bushbuck and baboons for leopards. The prey base of these cats, while varied, shares a core characteristic that has profoundly shaped their killing technique. It is soft. Relative to what the jaguar evolved to hunt, the prey of Africa and Asia is soft, the throat is accessible, the muzzle can be clamped. The suffocation approach works reliably because the prey's anatomy does not present serious mechanical resistance to a sustained jaw hold on the neck. The prey community in which the jaguar evolved was different in ways that matter enormously to predatory strategy. South America's ecological history is one of the most unusual on Earth. The continent spent tens of millions of years in geographic isolation, developing a fauna that was unlike anything elsewhere. When the Isthmus of Panama closed approximately 3 million years ago and allowed faunal interchange between North and South America, the ancestral jaguar, arriving from North America, encountered a prey landscape that included not just the ungulates and peccaries and tapirs that it is known to hunt today, but an extraordinary diversity of heavily armored, heavily constructed, biomechanically formidable prey that presented physical challenges to killing. Giant armadillos, glyptodonts whose shells were essentially bone fortresses, large caimans and crocodilians, river turtles with shells that could resist substantial crushing force. The South American prey community, shaped by its own deep evolutionary history, had developed in directions that no amount of throat clamping could address reliably. The jaguar's response to this prey landscape, played out across hundreds of thousands of generations of selection, was to become something unprecedented in the felid world. It became a crusher. Where other big cats evolved for grip and hold, the jaguar evolved for penetration and destruction. Its skull is shorter and more rounded than any other large felid, a morphology that sacrifices the long snout leverage of a lion or leopard in exchange for something different. It concentrates force. Short-skulled animals, in the mechanics of jaw function, generate higher bite forces per unit of jaw muscle because the moment arm geometry is more efficient. The jaguar has the highest bite force relative to body size of any large cat in the world, and among all felids is exceeded in raw bite force only by the lion and tiger, both of which are substantially larger animals. Per unit body weight, the jaguar bites harder than a tiger. Per unit body weight, it bites harder than a lion. It bites harder than a leopard of the same size by a margin that is not close. It bites harder, in relative terms, than any other cat alive. But bite force alone does not explain the skull strike technique. A lion is capable of generating enormous, absolute bite force, and it does not use it to pierce skulls. A tiger, the largest felid alive, with the highest absolute bite force of any cat, does not kill by driving its teeth through the cranium of its prey. The skull strike is not simply a function of having a powerful jaw. It is a function of how that jaw force is deployed, which is a behavioral and neurological question as much as a biomechanical one. And the answer to that question runs deeper than the musculature of the jaw itself. The jaguar's canine teeth are proportionally different from those of other large cats, in ways that most general accounts of the species miss. They are not simply larger. They are shaped differently. They are rounder in cross-section, more conical, more like an awl than a blade. The canines of a lion or tiger are laterally compressed, somewhat flattened, designed to slip between vertebrae and sever the spinal cord, or to penetrate the trachea and maintain a hold while the prey suffocates. They are cutting and gripping instruments. The canine teeth of a jaguar are more circular in cross-section, which is a shape that distributes stress more evenly through the tooth structure and makes the tooth far more resistant to the lateral forces that would be generated when trying to penetrate a hard, rounded surface like a skull or a shell. A laterally compressed canine, driven against a curved, hard surface, would be exposed to bending forces that could crack or shear the tooth. A more cylindrical canine is engineered to function as a punch, driving straight through resistance without the risk of lateral failure. The jaguar's teeth are, in their cross-sectional geometry, built for what the jaguar does with them. The temporal and masseteric muscles that drive jaw closure in the jaguar are arranged in a configuration that differs subtly but significantly from those of other large cats. The temporal muscle, which originates on the side of the skull and inserts on the coronoid process of the lower jaw, is relatively larger in the jaguar. The zygomatic arch, the bony structure from which the masseter muscle hangs, is broader and more flared outward in the jaguar than in lions or leopards of comparable skull size. These morphological details are not accidents. They are the physical record of selection pressure operating over deep time, favoring animals whose jaw architecture allowed them to generate higher forces through shorter gape angles, which is precisely the geometry of a bite intended to penetrate a hard surface rather than to hold a struggling prey animal at a distance from the body. The sensory architecture that guides where the jaguar places its killing bite is, in some respects, the most remarkable part of the whole system. All cats have sensory receptors in their lips and the skin surrounding their muzzle that provide information about the position and shape of prey held in the mouth. These receptors, combined with the mechanical feedback from the teeth themselves, allow a cat to make real-time adjustments to its jaw position during the killing sequence. In suffocating felids, this system guides the teeth to the trachea or the vertebrae of the neck. In the jaguar, this same sensory system appears to be used in a categorically different way, to find the thin points in a skull, the sutures between cranial bones, the orbital regions, the joint surfaces, and to position the canines for penetration at the precise location where the bone is thinnest and the brain is most directly accessible. Whether this positioning is fully learned, fully innate, or some combination is a question that behavioral ecologists have been working on for decades and have not fully resolved. But the consistency of the bite placement across wild jaguars hunting caimans in different populations suggests a strong innate component refined by individual experience. The caiman specifically presents a prey challenge that illustrates why the skull strike is not simply preferable to the suffocation method, but is essentially the only viable option for a predator attempting to kill this animal in the water or at the water's edge. Caimans do not have a soft throat in any meaningful sense. The ventral surface of a caiman, the underside, is softer than the dorsal armor, but accessing it requires inverting a 5-foot reptile that is fighting back, in the water, where its tail is a significant weapon, and where its own jaw is capable of inflicting catastrophic injury to a cat that has committed to a hold on the body. The caiman's body is a set of interlocking defense systems. The dorsal osteoderms protect against attacks from above and behind. The tail generates force that can break bones. The jaw, which can slam shut with explosive power, is an active weapon rather than a passive defensive structure. There is no suffocation hold available on this prey. There is no angle from which a cat, pressing its jaw against the caiman's throat and waiting, can achieve a reliable kill before the caiman inflicts serious or fatal injuries in return. The skull is the solution to all of these problems simultaneously. The top of the caiman's skull, specifically the region over the temporal fenestrae, the bony openings in the skull roof, is the single point on the caiman's body where the bony protection is thinnest and where a penetrating bite can access the brain directly. Caimans do not have the thick temporal bone that covers the equivalent region in large mammals. Their cranial anatomy, despite the impressive osteoderms elsewhere, leaves the top of the skull relatively vulnerable to a precisely placed crushing and penetrating force. The jaguar's killing bite on a caiman is not delivered blindly to anywhere on the skull. It is delivered to this specific region with a consistency that, across thousands of documented kills, approaches the reliability of a hardwired motor program rather than a learned skill applied flexibly to a variable target. What this means practically is that the jaguar kills a caiman in an exchange that is often over before the caiman has fully registered what is happening. The bite is placed, the canines penetrate the skull, the brain is destroyed or severely disrupted, and the prey item transitions from fighting animal to dead weight in a time frame measured in seconds. This is not how the jaguar kills all of its prey. Against soft-bodied mammals, deer, peccaries, capybara, tapirs, the jaguar is capable of using the suffocation method, and sometimes does, though it more commonly uses a variation of the skull strike or a neck bite that severs the cervical vertebrae rather than closing the airway. But the skull strike is what defines the jaguar's killing repertoire as unique, and the caiman represents the prey against which its adaptive significance is most completely on display, because the caiman is the prey that makes every other killing method fail. The documentation of skull strike technique in wild populations began in earnest in the Pantanal, the world's largest tropical wetland, which sprawls across western Brazil into portions of Bolivia and Paraguay, and which supports the densest known jaguar population anywhere in the species range. The Pantanal is jaguar habitat in a way that almost no other place on Earth is jaguar habitat. The combination of prey density, water access, and habitat structure produces jaguar densities in the northern Pantanal that rival those of the most productive lion territories in the Serengeti. It also produces, within that population, jaguar individuals that have become specialized caiman hunters, to a degree that their conspecifics in forest habitats are not, and it is from the detailed behavioral observation of these individuals that the skull strike technique was first described systematically in scientific literature. The researchers who first documented the behavior with sufficient precision to begin quantifying it noted something immediately striking about the sequence of events in a jaguar caiman hunt. The initiation was not what they expected based on their understanding of large cat predatory behavior from studies of lions and tigers. There was very little stalking in the conventional sense. Jaguars hunting caimans in the Pantanal rely heavily on an approach from the water or from a position within the water itself, often partially submerged, using the water surface as a concealment medium in a way that feels more like a crocodilian hunting strategy than a felid one. The jaguar approaches the basking caiman from the waterside or along the bank in a low, slow glide that keeps its profile minimal and its movement extremely controlled. It does not use the vegetation stalking approach that characterizes lion hunts or the wind-reading approach that characterizes tiger hunts. It uses the water, and then it moves fast. The final approach is explosive and brief, and the strike itself, the placement of the jaw, happens with a speed that high frame rate camera recording has since confirmed takes place in a fraction of a second. The jaw does not close on the caiman's body and then adjust. It closes in the correct position, with the canines over the temporal region of the skull, essentially on the first contact. This is the observation that most clearly points to an innate targeting component rather than a purely learned one. A purely learned behavior, applied flexibly through trial and error on each individual prey encounter, would show more variation in initial bite placement and more secondary adjustment after first contact. What the camera data shows is a consistency of initial placement that implies a pre-programmed targeting element, a neural template for bite placement that has been built into the jaguar's predatory machinery by selection and that is being expressed in each individual hunt with very little real-time negotiation. The question of how this behavior develops in individual jaguars has been partially addressed by observations of juvenile animals learning to hunt in the Pantanal. Young jaguars do not emerge from the natal period already killing caimans with the skull strike technique. They develop the behavior through a sequence that begins with play behavior, involving live prey caught by the mother, progresses through attempts at the skull strike that frequently fail and sometimes result in the young jaguar being bitten by the caiman before releasing it, and eventually resolves into the adult pattern of consistent first placement accuracy. The developmental trajectory suggests that the innate component provides the targeting template and the basic motor program, while individual experience refines the precision of execution and the behavioral context recognition that tells the jaguar when the strike opportunity is available. This developmental pattern mirrors what has been described for the suffocation bite in other large felids, where the basic motor pattern is present from early development but is refined by practice and by the specific prey species encountered during the learning period. The role of the mother in transmitting this behavior is interesting for what it does and does not appear to do. Jaguar mothers in caiman-rich habitats bring caimans, including live or stunned caimans, to their cubs during the period of active prey introduction that precedes independence. Cubs from mothers that are active caiman hunters become caiman hunters themselves at higher rates than cubs from mothers in areas where caimans are less available. This is, on the surface, consistent with simple social learning. The cub learns to hunt what the mother hunts by watching and practicing with the prey the mother provides. But the skull strike technique itself, the specific jaw placement, does not appear to require direct instruction to emerge. It appears in cubs that have never seen their mother make a successful skull strike kill, emerging in a rougher and less refined form, but recognizable as the same basic motor pattern. What the mother provides in caiman-rich habitats is primarily opportunity and exposure. The technique itself appears to come from somewhere deeper. The comparison with how other big cats develop their killing techniques is instructive here. Lion cubs raised in captivity without exposure to prey animals will perform a killing neck bite on appropriate prey when first exposed to it, even without having seen the behavior performed. The motor program is there, prior to experience, even if its precise calibration requires experience to complete. Tiger cubs show the same pattern with the suffocation bite. The killing bite in felids is not a blank slate that requires social learning to write onto. It is a pre-formed program that requires experience to calibrate and context to trigger. The jaguar skull strike appears to follow exactly this logic, with the additional twist that the precise targeting of the temporal region of a caiman's skull is somehow encoded in the program in a way that emerges reliably across individuals that have had very different developmental experiences, suggesting a neural template that is genuinely specific to this prey type and this attack geometry. The biomechanical analysis that has been applied to the skull strike in the years since it was first carefully documented has produced findings that continue to surprise researchers who come to the question with expectations built from other felid predatory systems. The force generated by a large male jaguar's closing bite on the temporal region of a caiman skull has been estimated through several methods, including bite force measurement from trained captive animals, mathematical modeling based on muscle cross-sectional areas and moment arm geometries, and forensic analysis of skull damage in killed prey. The estimates converge on a range that represents the highest bite force per unit body mass of any mammalian predator alive. Not the highest absolute bite force, the highest relative bite force. The relevance of this to the skull strike specifically is that the temporal region of a caiman skull, while thinner than most of the cranial structure, still represents a hard-shelled target. The forces required to penetrate it are not trivial. A large adult caiman's skull in the temporal region has been measured at thicknesses that would require forces in excess of 700 to 1,000 pounds per square inch to reliably penetrate with a point load. The jaguar's estimated bite force at the canine tips falls within the range that makes this penetration biomechanically plausible, and in large adult males, comfortably achievable. The geographic variation in caiman hunting behavior across the Jaguars range reveals something important about the relationship between prey availability, behavioral expression, and the underlying biological capability. Jaguars in the Amazon basin, where caimans are present, but where the forest structure and the relative abundance of terrestrial mammalian prey mean that caimans are not a primary prey source for most individuals, show lower rates of caiman predation than Pantanal jaguars, and in some studies show less precise skull strike placement when caiman predation is documented. Jaguars in coastal areas of Central America, where sea turtle nesting beaches represent a seasonal prey resource, have been documented applying a version of the skull strike to sea turtles, penetrating or crushing the skull of an animal whose shell is impenetrable, demonstrating that the technique generalizes to armored prey beyond the caiman. Jaguars in the Belize River Valley and elsewhere in Central America have been documented killing spectacled caimans, which are smaller and somewhat less formidably armored than the Yacare caimans of the Pantanal, using the same fundamental bite placement. The technique is not Pantanal-specific, it is Jaguar-specific. What varies is how frequently and against how precisely armored a prey the technique is expressed. The question of whether the skull strike represents the ancestral killing method in the jaguar's evolutionary lineage, or whether it evolved within the jaguar lineage as a derived specialization for South American prey, is one that paleontologists and phylogenetic biologists have been working on with increasing precision as the fossil record of jaguar ancestors has been supplemented by molecular phylogenetic analysis. The genus Panthera originated in Asia and dispersed outward from there, and the ancestral Panthera from which the jaguar lineage diverged was almost certainly using something closer to the suffocation method that all other living Panthera species use. The specialized jaw morphology, the rounded canines, the relative temporal muscle enlargement that characterizes modern jaguars is not present in fossil Panthera specimens that predate the jaguar's colonization of South America. It appears in the lineage after the South American encounter, tracking chronologically with the period during which ancestral jaguars were integrating into a prey community that included large armored prey. This is not a perfect experimental design. The fossil record of jaw morphology is incomplete, and the inference of killing technique from skull morphology in extinct species involves assumptions that can be challenged. But the broad pattern is consistent with the hypothesis that the skull strike technique evolved in the jaguar lineage as an adaptive response to South American prey, rather than being present prior to that colonization as an ancestral condition. The extinct species that represent the jaguar's closest evolutionary relatives provide a partial window into this trajectory. Panthera gombazoagensis, the European jaguar, which was widespread across Europe and Asia in the Pleistocene before going extinct around 500,000 years ago, had a skull morphology intermediate between modern jaguars and other Panthera species, slightly shorter and more robust than a lion, with zygomatic arches somewhat more flared. Whether it used anything like the skull strike technique is not knowable from the fossil record, but the morphological intermediacy is at least consistent with the hypothesis that the skull architecture that enables the modern jaguar's killing technique was developing through this evolutionary stage. The North American jaguar, Panthera onca augusta, which overlapped with the modern jaguar species both temporally and geographically in the Pleistocene, was substantially larger than modern jaguars and had skull proportions that suggest even higher bite forces than the modern species, living during a period when the North American prey community included giant ground sloths, American horses, and Pleistocene tapirs that would have presented formidable prey challenges of their own. The modern jaguar's range has contracted dramatically from its Pleistocene extent. It was once present throughout the southern United States, from California and Texas through Florida, and its range extended into the southern portions of what is now the American Southwest as recently as the early 20th century. The last confirmed wild jaguar in the United States that was not a dispersing Mexican individual was killed in Arizona in 1963. The range contraction that has occurred since the Pleistocene, and that has accelerated dramatically in the 20th century, has produced a species whose current distribution occupies perhaps half the area it occupied a century ago, and perhaps 10 to 20% of the area it occupied at the Pleistocene maximum. This contraction matters to the skull strike story because it reflects the forces that are now determining in which ecological contexts the jaguar's unique adaptations are being deployed, and in which ecosystems the behavioral and biological legacy of millions of years of South American prey specialization continues to be expressed. The Pantanal's importance in this picture extends well beyond being the site where the skull strike was first well documented. The Pantanal supports the largest and most demographically stable jaguar population in the species range, and it does so in part because of the extraordinary prey density that the wetland ecosystem provides. The Yacare caiman, whose population in the Pantanal alone is estimated at somewhere between 10 and 35 million individuals, depending on the survey method and the seasonal flooding cycle, represents a prey resource of essentially limitless availability for a predator equipped to exploit it. A combination of unlimited prey and a killing technique precisely matched to that prey's defenses has produced in the Pantanal jaguar population something that functions almost like an ecological optimization. The jaguars here are larger, on average, than jaguars in forest habitats. Adult males in the northern Pantanal regularly exceed 250 pounds, with some individuals documented above 300 pounds. This size increase relative to forest-adapted jaguars is consistent with the higher caloric density and availability of the prey base, and with the selective advantages that larger body size confers in prey that requires penetration of a hard skull, where more mass behind the bite translates directly into more penetrating force at the canine tip. The largest Pantanal jaguar males, the ones that researchers and guides have given names to, the ones that have become icons of wildlife tourism in the Transpantanera region, are animals that have been hunting caimans for a decade or more and have refined the skull strike to a level of efficiency that approaches the theoretical optimum. Field observations of these individuals document hunts in which the caiman shows no behavioral response following the strike, no tail thrashing, no jaw snapping, no movement at all, suggesting death or complete neurological disruption, essentially coincident with the bite contact. The contrast with what happens when the bite is imprecisely placed, as occasionally occurs with younger or less experienced individuals, is dramatic and instructive. A jaguar that places the bite slightly off-center, over the thicker parietal bone rather than the temporal fenestra, will often not penetrate the skull. The caiman will thrash violently. The jaguar will release it. There will be a scramble, often in the water, that represents real injury risk for both animals. The precision of placement in experienced adults is not aesthetic. It is the difference between a technique that works and one that does not. The caiman's evolutionary response to the jaguar's predation pressure is an interesting question that has not received as much attention as the jaguar's predatory strategy itself. The Yacare caiman population of the Pantanal has been experiencing jaguar predation at a significant rate for as long as both species have coexisted there, which in geological terms is not that long. Caimans colonized South America from North America via the same land bridge that allowed jaguar ancestors to move south, and the co-evolution of jaguar and caiman in South American wetland environments is a relatively recent event in evolutionary terms, measured in millions of years rather than tens of millions. The caiman's temporal fenestrae have not thickened. The osteoderms over the skull roof have not become more substantial. There is no obvious morphological evidence of an evolutionary arms race in the skull defenses of caiman populations with high jaguar predation pressure relative to those with low predation pressure. This could mean the predation pressure has not been intense enough over a long enough period to drive detectable selection. It could mean the constraints on skull architecture in crocodilians, which are deeply conservative in their basic body plan, make modification of the temporal region biomechanically difficult without compromising other functions. It could mean the caiman's best defense against jaguar predation is behavioral, staying in water, maintaining vigilance, and avoiding the bank basking postures that make skull strike approach possible, rather than anatomical. The behavioral response may be absorbing the selection pressure that would otherwise drive anatomical change. The jaguar's relationship to water is itself a significant part of the skull strike story, because it is the ecological context that makes consistent access to caiman prey possible, and it represents another major behavioral departure from the norm among large felids. Lions avoid deep water except when necessary to cross it. Tigers wade and swim with tolerance, but not with enthusiasm. Leopards are cautious around water. The jaguar actively uses water as a hunting environment, swimming between islands in the Pantanal, pursuing prey into rivers, and approaching caiman prey from the water rather than from the bank. This affinity for aquatic hunting is not accidental and is not simply a learned response to the availability of aquatic prey. It is encoded in the jaguar's behavioral repertoire in a way that differs from other big cats, and it almost certainly represents an evolutionary modification that accompanied the development of the skull strike technique. Because the skull strike as a method for killing caimans is most reliably executed from the water or at the water's edge, in the approach geometry that minimizes the caiman's defensive reactions and maximizes the jaguar's positional advantage for the precise bite placement that makes the technique work. The encounter dynamics of a jaguar-caiman hunt in the Pantanal have been described in detail by researchers who have spent hundreds of hours observing from boats and hides, and the description reads unlike any other large cat hunt documented in the scientific literature. The jaguar does not use a concealment stalk that terminates in a sprint. It does not use a cooperative group strategy. It does not use any of the approach geometries that characterize the hunts of the other large cats, whose behavior has been studied in detail. It uses the water as a medium, staying low and barely disturbing the surface, approaching the basking caiman from an angle that keeps the jaguar in the caiman's blind spot, which for a crocodilian is a narrower zone than for a mammal but exists at the direct posterior, behind the eye line, where the caiman's binocular and monocular visual fields do not overlap effectively with the olfactory and auditory information that would otherwise compensate. The final approach covers the last several feet in what observers describe as an eruption rather than a run, a single explosive surge that places the jaguar's jaw on the caiman's skull before the caiman has completed the sensory processing that would trigger a defensive or escape response. The speed of this final surge has been estimated at between 15 and 20 miles per hour across the water surface, which for an animal the size of a large Pantanal jaguar represents a mechanical commitment that is difficult to overstate. This is not a cautious predator feeling out its prey. This is a precision instrument, deploying its technique with confidence, built from experience and a biological capability perfectly matched to the task. The post-strike behavior of experienced caiman-hunting jaguars reveals something about the efficacy of the technique that is itself remarkable. Following a successful skull strike on a large caiman, the jaguar typically holds the bite position for 2 to 5 seconds, and then begins moving toward the bank, carrying the caiman in the jaw position in which it was killed. There is no period of immobilization of a struggling prey animal. There is no sustained suffocation hold. There is no defensive grappling with a tail or jaw. The caiman is dead, or functionally so, and the jaguar moves immediately to the consumption phase, without the intervening period of prey management that characterizes kills by suffocation in lions and tigers, which can last 10 or 15 minutes, during which the prey animal is still partially active and the predator is investing energy in maintaining the kill hold while avoiding injury from the prey's defensive responses. The skull strike collapses this phase to near zero, which is an energetic and injury risk reduction that compounds across thousands of hunts over a lifetime, producing a predator whose lifetime feeding efficiency is substantially higher than it would be if it were using the suffocation method against the same prey. The energetic accounting here matters more than it might initially seem. A jaguar attempting to suffocate a large adult caiman would face a scenario in which the prey animal's armor prevents access to the throat. The prey animal's tail and jaw can inflict serious injury during a sustained grappling period, and the water environment amplifies the prey's defensive capability while reducing the predator's positional control. The expected injury rate from this approach across a lifetime of caiman hunting would be substantial. Broken bones, lacerations from caiman jaws, tail impacts, all of these represent potential reductions in the predator's long-term fitness. The skull strike, by eliminating the sustained struggle phase, eliminates most of this injury risk. A jaguar that kills with the skull strike is not just a more efficient energy acquirer, it is a predator that sustains injuries less frequently in hunting, which translates directly into longer productive life, more reproductive opportunities, and higher lifetime fitness. The evolutionary logic of the skull strike is not just about killing efficiency. It is about lifetime injury avoidance in a prey landscape where the alternative approaches carry serious costs. The ecological consequences of the jaguar's caiman predation extend beyond the direct predator-prey relationship in ways that have only recently begun to be quantified. Caimans are keystone species in their wetland ecosystems. They are apex predators of the aquatic environment, consuming fish, water birds, capybara, and a variety of other wetland animals in quantities that shape the structure of the communities they inhabit. They also serve as nutrient conduits, moving energy and biomass between aquatic and terrestrial systems through their movements and their consumption of prey from both environments. Jaguar predation on caimans is not a trivial ecological force. In the northern Pantanal, where jaguar densities are highest and the caiman hunting specialization is most developed, estimates of the rate of caiman mortality attributable to jaguar predation suggest a meaningful contribution to the demographic structure of local caiman populations. This is not a simple predator-prey dyad. It is a set of ecological relationships in which the jaguar's unique killing capability allows it to access a prey resource that no other terrestrial predator in its ecosystem can reliably exploit at scale, and in doing so, to exert a trophic influence that cascades through the wetland food web in ways that we are only beginning to understand. The research programs that have been most productive in advancing our understanding of the skull strike and its ecological context have been built on long-term individual identification of Pantanal jaguars, which became practical with the development of camera trap networks and GPS collar technology in the early 2000s. Individual jaguars in the northern Pantanal can be identified reliably from their rosette patterns, which are as individually unique as human fingerprints. And the combination of camera trap identification, GPS telemetry, and direct behavioral observation from boats has produced behavioral and demographic datasets on this population that are among the most detailed and longitudinally extensive for any large carnivore population anywhere. From these datasets have come not just descriptions of the skull strike technique in individual hunts, but quantifications of kill rates, prey size selection, habitat use, and temporal behavior patterns that allow researchers to place the skull strike in the broader context of the jaguar's ecological role in the Pantanal. What the long-term data show is that the skull strike technique is not uniformly expressed across all prey or all individuals. Young jaguars, as noted, develop it progressively, with increasing precision and decreasing failure rate through their first few years of hunting experience. Old jaguars, those in the late portion of their adult lifespan where dental wear becomes significant, show declining kill efficiency that appears related to the physical condition of their canine teeth, which is the expected finding if the technique depends specifically on canine penetration of the skull. Jaguars in areas with lower caiman density show lower rates of the skull strike specifically against caimans, though they may apply the same technique to other hard-bodied prey. Female jaguars, which are substantially smaller than males in the Pantanal, with average weights perhaps 30 to 40% lower, hunt caimans less frequently than males and tend towards smaller caiman size classes when they do. This is consistent with the force requirements of the skull strike, where smaller body size means lower absolute bite force, and therefore a smaller window of caiman size, over which the technique is reliably executable. The technique is not equally available to all jaguars at all times. Its expression is modulated by individual size, age, condition, and experience, in ways that reveal the underlying biomechanical and developmental constraints. The management implications of the jaguar's specific dependence on aquatic wetland habitats for the expression of its most distinctive predatory behavior are significant for conservation biology. The jaguar is not threatened primarily by hunting pressure across most of its range. It is threatened by habitat loss, specifically by the conversion of intact habitat to agricultural and pasture land that reduces the prey base available to jaguars and that fragments the landscape in ways that isolate subpopulations and reduce genetic connectivity. The Pantanal, specifically, is under agricultural pressure from soy and cattle operations that have already converted substantial areas of the dryland margins of the wetland, and that threaten the hydrology of the wetland itself through upstream water management changes. If the Pantanal's seasonal flood pulse, which is the ecological engine that drives the extraordinary prey productivity of the wetland, is disrupted by upstream dams or water diversion, the caiman population that provides the prey base for the jaguar's skull strike specialization would be the first major prey category to decline, because caimans are more dependent on the flood pulse than terrestrial mammalian prey. A jaguar population that has become partially specialized on caiman prey would face not just a reduction in total prey availability, but a specific loss of the prey type for which its unique killing apparatus is most precisely adapted. This is the specificity of the conservation concern that the skull strike story illuminates. It is not simply about preserving enough habitat for jaguars to survive. It is about preserving the ecological conditions under which the jaguar's most extraordinary biological adaptation continues to be expressed in the way it evolved to be expressed. The skull strike technique requires living caimans in accessible positions. It requires the water environment in which the approach geometry works. It requires the prey density that makes specialization economically viable. Remove any of these elements, and the jaguar does not immediately go extinct. It is a flexible predator with a broad prey repertoire, but it loses the ecological context in which the full expression of what it is becomes possible. A jaguar eating capybara and peccaries in a degraded landscape is still a jaguar and still an important predator. But it is a jaguar that is not fully jaguar in the way that a Pantanal male of 280 pounds, exploding from the water onto the skull of a 6-foot caiman and killing it before the caiman's brain has registered the contact, is fully jaguar. The skull strike is not just a behavioral curiosity. It is the most complete expression of what 3 million years of evolution in the Americas have built. There is something philosophically significant about the way the jaguar's skull strike technique sits in relation to the broader universe of large cat predatory behavior. The suffocation kill, used with variations by every other large felid, is a technique built on time. It is a technique that uses the predator's grip strength, its body mass, and positional leverage, and its tolerance for the sustained engagement with a struggling prey animal to outlast the prey's respiratory system. It is a technique that works by taking something away from the prey over time. The skull strike is something different. It is a technique built on precision and force applied in a single moment. It is a technique that works not by outlasting anything, but by ending the prey's neurological function before the prey's neurological function can coordinate a defensive response. It does not take time away from the caiman. It takes the caiman's capacity to use time. In this sense, it is more like what a spider's venom does to an insect, or what a mantis shrimp's dactyl club does to a crab, than what a lion's throat grip does to a wildebeest. It is an instantaneous incapacitation delivered by a precision instrument, rather than a sustained suppression delivered by endurance. The fact that this technique evolved in a mammalian predator